Okay, so in this lesson, we're going to finish out our UV unwrapping for this asset, and we're going to close out the clothing analogy that I was using, where in the previous lesson, we went and added those seam lines to our models here, and we've created all of these, singular UV shells, and we've gone and flattened out a lot of those. Now's the time to actually appropriately unwrap all of this and pack it into the 0 to 1 texture space that we have here with this procedural texture that we've created. Again, the texture itself isn't important, just the square space that we're going to be laying our UVs out inside of. And so when we're trying to UV unwrap our models, generally the workflow is finding the best texture resolution, right? So that we're going to have very crisp textures on our models, while also making sure that we're optimizing our UV space here. So most of our texture space is being occupied by a UV shell. So we're not having any wasted pixels. So when I'm working with UVs, what I generally like to do is first isolate UVs based off of our objects here. So we have these three separate objects, our air cap, hub, and rubber. So if we take a look at the tire, right, we've gone and laid these out. What I'm going to do is select all of these and just move those over to the left so that I know these are going to be for our rubber. I'll select our hub. I'm going to move these all up above our texture set there. So that's going to be for the hub. And if I come in here and select our air cap, again, I'll move that maybe over onto the right-hand side here. So now you may be wondering, how do you even really kind of start unwrapping these to an appropriate size, right? And how do you decide what is your biggest texture resolution? How much resolution can you give these particular UV shells? And I generally try and start with the physically biggest UV shell on our model here. And for this particular asset, it's going to be the tread pattern here that runs from the top all the way down to the bottom. And then we've seamed it off and it repeats on the other side. So if I go into edit mode for these again, we can see that these two areas are going to be the biggest UV shells that we have. And so I'm going to try and unwrap the rest of our tire to match this texture resolution, because we're not going to be able to scale these up anymore, right? These are kind of at the max of the UV space that we have allowed for us in this square texture ratio. So it's only going to make sense that we can scale everything else up to match these if we need to. Now, what I'm going to do for these is actually rotate them 90 degrees, and I'll maybe rotate them this way here, and just making sure I can see which one this is. Okay, so that we're going to have our text running kind of along the curvature of the tire. And this is, something we've seen in the previous lesson. Now I want to make sure that these are both running the same direction here. So I'll rotate this one around like that, so we can see that these are going to run that same way. And I'm actually going to use the follow active quads operator on these, just because I want to make sure that these lines line up here. So I'm going to go and find a nice kind of square area. Again, using the auto align tool, and then follow to active quads. That's just going to help with the display of the texture. You can see here it's going to minimize the skew or the distortion on the UV unwrap there. And I'll repeat this process for our other one as well. Awesome. So with these pieces here, I'll make sure that we can go and fit these into our UV space nicely. And I want to make sure that I'm not just putting these right on the boundary of our UV space, but actually pushing them in just a little bit so we're getting some pixels at the border to avoid having any kind of display issues down the line. Now, if you put these very close to the edge, you might notice later on as we start to texture that you're getting some weird discoloration at the seam lines, and that has to do with pixel bleeding. And in short, pixel bleeding is just going to be the bleeding of pixel display around the seam lines, where it doesn't really know what type of color information to display. usually based on UV shells' proximity to areas that have different color pixels on them. So we give a little bit of a buffer zone in between our UV shells and the outside of the texture. And we're even going to do that with our UV shells as well. So I've got this one squared out, and I'm going to bring this down. And I'm just going to make sure that we have a little bit of a UV buffer area there. Now with these side UV shells, what I want to take a look at is we'll notice this one here is a little bit more elongated along the horizontal axis. And if we take a look in our 3D space, we'll see that these squares look a lot more rectangular just on the display versus this one here, which is a lot more square, more consistent and less distortion along our UV unwrap. So what I want to do is I want to just squish this one back down on the x-axis here so that it's going to match the x-axis of this one here. Again, these should be the same exact lengths across these UV shells, right? Because they should be symmetrical for the most part. So that's starting to look a lot better. And I'll just make sure that this lines up in my UV space vertically, and that looks pretty good too. And we'll just quickly jump over to the other side, making sure that these all kind of line up. And I might go and just stretch this one out a little bit again so that these all are relatively the same horizontal distance here. There we go. So that's looking all right. So now we can go and drag these guys in. Now I want to make sure that if we take a look, we're also matching up the texture resolution across these UV shells, which we'll see right now is not the case. The tread is getting a lot more texture resolution as opposed to these side pieces here. And that's going to be based on the number of repetitions we'll see and just the scaling of these letters, numbers, and boxes. So what I want to do for this is I'm going to select our biggest piece here. And this is this tread that we created for the, I believe it's the back piece here. And I'm going to hit N on my keyboard, and I'm going to go down to where we have the Texel Density Checker add-on enabled. And this is one that we enabled right at the beginning of the project. So if you're not sure exactly what this is, head back to the setup video. But this is going to allow me to get a consistent size for all of the UV shells that we're going to be creating so that all of this texture resolution is going to be as consistent as possible. So the first thing we want to do is we want to make sure that our units are in pixels per centimeter. And I want to set my texture size to be 2048. Now you can also set this to be something higher like 4096 if that's going to be the resolution you want to work at. But for this project, we're just going to set it at 2048 so that a lot of our textures and our, procedural processing for Substance Painter just works a little bit faster as I'm recording. So now that I've got that set with this tread shell selected, what I want to do is I want to calculate the texel density of this piece. So when I select this, we'll see that the density is going to be 1.543. And it didn't change just because it was already set to that. But you can see as I start to select some of these, it's going to change that texel density. But what this essentially means is that the UV shell is going to display 1.45 pixels per centimeter in the real 3D space here. So this is a tangible number that we can use to set a consistent resolution of all these shells on our asset. So now if I select, say, this shell down here, and I'm just going to take this number and place it into our set texel density value field here. Now what I can do is select set my texel density, and it might have been just the slightest change, but if I hit Control Z, you can see that when I set my texel density, it actually scaled this up just a little bit to match the same texel resolution. And we're really going to notice it now if I select all four of those side shells and hit set my texel density, because it's greatly increased the size of these UV shells here. so that now we're getting a very, very consistent textile density across all of these UV shells. So now I can go and just slot these in really quickly. Again, making sure that we're leaving some space right at the edges of our UV sheet. I also want to make sure that we're leaving some space in between our UV shells here. And again, we'll just quickly go and line these up. So that'll be it for our tire tread here. I think that's a pretty good start, and we're getting really good texture resolution across these. Now the real test is going to be how this scales across multiple objects and how it interacts with their UV shells. So if I go and select this here, again, we've got all of our hub pieces unwrapped already and they're all squared out or flattened. But what I want to do is select them all, and I want to set them at that textile density as well. So if I select them all and hit set at textile density, you can see it's actually scaled them down because the resolution was a little bit too high for what we had originally, based on this 1.45 pixels per centimeter measurement. Now this is going to look a little bit more consistent, but now we need to pack this in with the other UV shells that we have. So I'll select both of these and just make sure I have everything selected. And now we need to figure out how we want to package these all together in our UV space. So the first thing I generally try to do is I'll take these circular donut shapes because they're generally the hardest to fit in. And I'll put these in first and just kind of solidify a spot for them. And I think the spot that I'm going to want to put them is this vertical kind of empty space right here. Because like we were doing with these flattened out pieces, I want to make sure that these also are going to be rotated 90 degrees and running horizontally. So I'll take these donuts here, make sure I'm not overlapping anything there, just giving them a little bit of space. And again, I'll bring this down here and just maybe put it as close to the UVs and the edge as I can. And now I also want to make sure if I come into side orthographic that I want to rotate these appropriately so that our text is running relatively perpendicular to the up and down, left and right. So that if I go and want to texture this and have something, written across the top of this, I'm not having to rotate the text as I'm working in the UVs. I can just simply get something that's horizontally written, which by default it generally is, stamp it on, and it's going to be perfectly aligned on our UV shell. And same thing for the other one. Sweet, so that's looking pretty cool. Now I can go and take these other parts here, which if we take a look is going to be these side shells here. Let's go and rotate these 90 degrees, making sure they're all lined up accordingly. And I've actually selected the wrong one here. There we go. And making sure the squash and the stretch of these is a little bit nicer. Actually, I'll stretch that one out just a little bit so it's matching. Maybe bring that one in a little bit. Make sure the vertical, and you can see again the vertical mismatch here is a little bit unideal. So I'll just see which one I like the best. And I think I'm going to like the distribution of this one here. So I'm going to go and just scale that one in on the Y a little bit so that these are looking pretty good. So now I'll just go and line these guys up and bring these in. And now you'll notice that we're running into a bit of an issue here, right? Where I could go ahead and say move this piece over here to make sure it fits in. But keep in mind, I still have two more pieces here, as well as some smaller pieces for the interiors of this hub. And we also still have the UVs for this guy here. So you might be able to make it work just by simply moving this over at this textile density. But what I want to do is instead just select everything. I'm going to switch our pivot mode from our bounding box to 2D cursor. And we want to make sure our 2D cursor is down at the origin. So again, Shift S, cursor to world origin. And I'm just going to scale this all down until this fits nice and snug in our UV space here. And then I'll go and switch this back to median point instead of bounding box, whatever it was by default. And then we'll repeat this process for the other side. So again, making sure these are rotated the correct way. I'm going to want to make sure that these also are aligned in their distribution of skew and distortion here. And I think I'm going to take the left-hand side here, and that's going to be this guy. And just make sure it's aligned with our other ones over there. I'll go and scale this out on the X a little bit to match, and also just make sure this matches vertically as well. And that's looking pretty good. So again, we can go and line these up and just add these to our sheet. And now finally, let's go and select all of our interior pieces here. And we could go ahead and rotate these to make sure that they fit that 90-degree orientation rule that I've been following up until this point. But because these are so small and interior pieces, I'm really just going to slot them in wherever I think works the best. So I'll probably stack these guys just along here, and then we can go and slot these all just up along the top here. And this is going to save us some room for the little air cap piece, which we're going to do right now. So let's go ahead and grab our air cap piece and then everything else, and go ahead and select that. And we'll notice that because we went and unwrapped our air cap by itself in the previous lesson, it's gone and unwrapped it in the context of 0 to 1. So it's going to try and fill that entire UV space as best as it can, which if we take a look on our model is going to be an insane amount of texture resolution, which frankly is just going to be a waste of space. So again, let's go and calculate the textile density of these pieces now. I just go and calculate that. And we'll see that after we scaled it down a little bit, now it's going to be 1.436. So we'll just set that to our set field there. So that now if I select this and set my textile density, it has greatly reduced the size of these in relation to its actual physical size in the 3D space. So that's going to give us, these really, really tiny assets, which is going to be cool, but this is now where I'm going to kind of backpedal a little bit and do a bit of a 180 on everything I've just shown you. Because I want to increase the resolution a little bit on this guy, just so that we're going to be getting some nice crisp textures on it, even though it is so tiny, because it's going to be a relatively prominent feature of the model here. So this is where I'm going to break that rule just a little bit. Now, I'm not going to break it drastically. Again, we don't want to have something with, crazy texture resolution like this, but understanding how textile density works across UV shells is going to allow us to break the rules in instances like this, where we don't want this to just have completely crushed texture resolution just because it is a smaller piece. So I'm going to scale this up to a point where it looks relatively crisp from a modest distance away. We could do something like that. Again, as we get closer, it's not very crisp, but from a viewpoint of something like this, we're not going to notice any of that kind of aliasing until we get up close to it. And that's going to help retain some of the resolution on what I'll say is a bit of an accent piece for this overall model. So we can go and place these wherever we think is going to work. And I know in the previous video I said that I was going to leave these, but it is kind of annoying me now that they aren't straightened out. So I'm going to go back on my word there, and let's just quickly straighten these out. And so now that we've got all that laid out, do a quick pass over of our model, making sure that's looking pretty good. I don't see any texture resolution that's really kind of standing out as being inconsistent. And I'll select all of our pieces here, and I want to calculate the final UV space usage. So that's something we kind of glossed over, didn't really look at actually at all previously. And that's going to be the overall occupation of space that these UV shells take up within this texture space. Now, like I was saying at the beginning of this lesson, this is what we want to try and balance out by occupying as much space as we possibly can while still maintaining that, nice texture resolution. So if I go ahead and calculate this, we can see that we're using around 86%. So 86% of these pixels are being utilized, and then that remaining 14% is going to be this open space. Now, in terms of UV space usage, 86% is generally considered a pretty good usage. You'll want to aim for as high as possible, and depending on the asset, it's going to vary wildly. Now, a general hard number to follow is 70% at the minimum. And depending on what studios you work with or work for, they might have a very different UV usage number that they try and target. Now, as we're learning to 3D model and UV unwrap, just try to aim for as high as possible, but I would suggest that if you're getting something that's lower than around 70%, to really try and think about unwrapping this a little bit differently, or like we had seen in the use case for this air cap, trying to find areas that maybe could kind of break that textile density rule just a little bit to kind of fudge these numbers and bump them up a little bit in your favor. And if you somehow manage to get a UV space usage of greater than 86%, kudos to you. I'm going to have you teach the rest of this course.